Great. So we are live on Zoom, and we are back. Should be now live on Facebook if everything worked the way it was supposed to. Apologies to the Facebook crowd. We did miss the brief introduction of our Humanities Council representative and her description of the Humanities Teacher of the Year program that Brandy Wilson is part of. Right now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this afternoon, this year's Humanities Teacher of the Year for Mississippi University for Women, Brandy Wilson. Brandy holds an MA and a PhD in creative writing from Florida State University and has been teaching at the W since 2018. Her novel, The Palace Blues, was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award and Alice B. Reader's Lavender Award winner. And she is at work on a short story collection, Still Queer, and a novel, Untitled. I think that's the title, not that it's not titled. Her short fiction and creative nonfiction has appeared in several literary magazines and anthologies, such as Sinister Wisdom, Pank, Lumina, LGBT authors, and those they inspired, and From Where You Dream, The Process of Writing Fiction, of a textbook by Robert Olin Butler. And she has published scholarship on LGBTQ writers. Brandy has also taught LGBTQ plus literature, first as a special topics class here at the W, both at the undergraduate level and also at the graduate level. And she has proposed both of those as classes for our regular rotation. In addition, she has taught undergraduate American literature surveys, creative writing, fiction workshop, English capstone, as well as graduate fiction workshops, forms in fiction, Southern fiction, modernist fiction, creative writing pedagogy, and I think I'm leaving a couple of things out. We've kept her pretty busy in the years that we've had her so far. She's also served as professor and faculty advisor for our literary magazine and literary magazine production class that produces Ponder Review. And she has directed many successful MFA theses. She's the current president of the Southern Literary Festival Association, and with the help of Chris Lee and others in our department, is putting on this year's festival, which will be held on our campus in April. And finally, she is also a faculty advisor for the student organization of ClearSpace. We're very proud to have Brandy with us and happy to have her lecture for us this afternoon. Please welcome Brandy Wilson.
Thank you, Kendall, and thank you, the Humanities Council. I am honored to get this award, and I'm very excited to be able to come here and share a lecture with you guys. So thank you for coming. The thing I love most about my job is my students. So I really appreciate those of you who are here in person and virtually. Another thing I love about my job is that I get to teach about things that I am passionate about. And one of those things is queer literature. One reason I'm so passionate about it is because it represents my own community and our continual battle to be seen as fully human. The primary goal for any human rights. Another thing I love about my job is that I get to teach about our continual battle. I'm in double time now. The primary goal for any human rights. Another thing I love about my job is that I get to teach about our continual battle. I'm in double time now. The primary goal for any human rights. Another thing I love about my job is that all right. Okay. A little technical difficulties. As I was saying, the goal of any humans and civil rights movement is to be humanized or humanizing people. And so that's a little bit about what I'll be talking about today. Literature as a cultural artifact representing culture and humanity. It can also be a vehicle for change. And one aspect of creating change is through accurate and humanizing representation or portrayals in literature. To be perfectly clear, what it means to be perfectly queer in literature has been a focus of debate for scholars, critics, readers, and writers for decades. So today I'll focus on creating queer representation, and I'll look at it through a sort of analytical and a craft perspective. I'll look at this representation, what it's been in the past, how it's evolved, where it is, and where it could go. And we'll discuss sort of the idea of what it means to be perfectly queer. I'm using the term queer here as a commonly accepted term in academia. It's reclaimed as an umbrella term covering many identities, including lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex, asexual, and many others. But I recognize that some of these identities are often obscured or erased under this umbrella. And I also recognize that the term queer itself has been and is still wielded as a weapon of discrimination and hate. But of course, I'll be using it here as a way to reinforce this reclaiming and its positive connotations. Queer characters, or as characters we would recognize as queer today, have always been a part of literature, and queer literature has a long history. But the recognition of it as such and scholarly interest in it is fairly recent. With this recognition and came representations few of us would recognize from real life. Because at the moment of the first recognition and later inquiry, the decades surrounding and including the 1950s or the mid 20th century, queer literature was scorned, it was policed, it was debated by society, publishers, writers, and even within the queer community itself. While at the same time, a lot of it was selling like hotcakes, especially queer pulp fiction. To give us a little bit of a foundation from a craft perspective, I'm going to first talk about characters and characterization and how writers can create characters on the page in well-crafted fiction. So if you'll go to the next slide. Oh, we got it. As one of my mentors has said, your fiction can only be as successful as the characters who move it and move within it. Another one of my mentors, Robert Owen Butler, says, fiction, though, is the art of human yearning. And the yearning is the thing that generates what we call plot, because elements of plot comes from thwarted, blocked, or challenged attempts to fulfill that yearning. So some people say that the big difference between literary fiction and craft fiction is that literary fiction is character-driven and genre fiction is plot-driven. But as we can see, these two things are very connected. Plot is character, character is plot. So it really comes down to character for queer representation and queer writers in all literature. When it comes to representation, we are looking at how writers create characters on the page. So what makes good characterization in fiction? Go to the next. I think you have to click a couple more times. There we go. The main criteria for characters in fiction is that we must find them interesting, we must find them believable, and we must care what happens to them. The ways that we create interesting, believable characters that readers care about is through direct characterization and indirect characterization. Direct is usually preferred. It's usually more immediate. It's more convincing, particularly for protagonists or main characters. So we prefer to get them characterized in dialogue, appearance, action, and thought. Indirectly, we can get characterization through authorial interpretation. The author tells us what to think about a character, or interpretation by another character. Character sort of tells us about another character. So we'll look at how these tools are used in representing queer characters. So first, next slide, we'll look at the evil queer character archetype stereotype fits too. Early on, representations of queer characters were often the pictures of evil, sometimes seductively so. They were sick, murderous, alcoholic, dangerous. And it's important to note, most were not protagonists. They were primarily depicted by independent means. So the author told us what to think about them, or another character told us what to think about them. The following examples that I'm going to give you are from another character's perspective, the protagonist's perspective. So from the confessed murder in Mary Wilkins Freeman's turn of the century murder mystery short story, The Long Arm, which was inspired by the sensationalized true crime stories of Lizzie Borden and Memphis's Alice Mitchell, to the rapist in Flannery O'Connor's 1960 novel, The Violent Bear Away, queer characters were villains. They were predators. And we can kind of see them described as monstrous in the descriptions I have here. In Freeman's, Phoebe Dole is depicted as overbearing. She's controlling. She's otherworldly. She is given an arm with superhuman length. The first person narrator describes her to us, and I think she may in fact be the real killer in the story. But she says that Phoebe is tall and very pale and thin, but she's never had a day's illness. She is plain, yet there's a kind of severe goodness about her colorless face, with the smooth bands of white hair over her ears. She gave me a strange look, half as if she would see into my very soul. Phoebe is said to have, and she confesses later, to have murdered a man who would have taken her 40-year-old quote-unquote roommate, Maria, away from her in marriage. We get direct methods of characterization, some dialogue, definitely some action, but it's given to us indirectly through another character. And this character too, we might realize at some point in the story, is somewhat biased, somewhat unreliable, because she too is suspected of the murder. In O'Connor's novel, the rapist is described as a pale, lean, old-looking young man with deep hollows under his cheekbones. He had on a lavender shirt and a thin black suit and a Panama hat. His lips were as white as the cigarette that hung limply from one side of his mouth. His eyes were the same color as his shirt and were ringed with heavy black lashes. As David K. Johnson notes, lavender was the color commonly associated with homosexuality in the mid-20th century. And this character is commonly understood by critics as a physical incarnation of the devil, drawing on mid-century convictions of the evilness of homosexuality. And this perception is also given, though not from the character himself, but in his perspective from the third person limited point of view. The main character is contemplating his spirituality, though he's morally suspect himself, and his views very much reflect this mid-century conviction of the evilness of homosexuality. And this conviction was culturally pervasive. I think it's interesting here to make a connection to film. The Hays Code was a self-imposed censorship of motion pictures that went into effect from 1934 to 1968. And this code specifically prohibited positive portrayals of homosexuals in film. This had some curious outcomes, particularly in films that were known for their clear-cut depictions of good and evil, and particularly for films that is their primary aim, such as Disney films. Let's go to the next slide. Something that's been recently and widely discussed is the preponderance of queer-coded Disney villains. That is, Disney villains that are given characteristics we recognize as stereotypically queer. Some of the most cited examples include Jafar's Aladdin, Jafar in Aladdin, Governor Ratcliffe in Pocahontas, Scar in The Lion King, Captain Hook in Peter Pan, and in The Little Mermaid, Ursula, who was in fact inspired by the drag queen Divine. I have a picture of both of them side by side here. Almost all of these evil depictions rely on stereotypes that equate gender nonconformity to homosexuality. And it's easy to understand the punishment of supporting or secondary queer characters that have been villainized, and that those that are interpreted for us through indirect methods, either by the characters in the story, or in the case of Disney, authorial interpretation. These characters rarely have the opportunity to move into a more substantial representation. They are what we might call one or two dimensional. They're limited rather than 3D, both because of how they're depicted and because of their role in the narrative. However, it doesn't get much better when characters are more fully developed. Go to the next slide. It was required that queer characters' stories ended in punishment, death, misery, or reform, but this was especially true for protagonists, and especially if they were sympathetic. And typically, if they were sympathetic, they were tragically so. Many depictions of these more fully drawn characters are limited by stereotypes. For example, in James Baldwin's 1956 novel, Giovanni's Room, about David, an American expatriate living in Paris, who is struggling with his sexual identity as he falls in love with the flamboyant Italian bartender Giovanni. The narrative is given directly by David, who becomes increasingly unreliable. Many of the queer characters in the book are described stereotypically, and this is part of David's struggle. A predominant theme of the book is his struggle with his masculinity, read toxic masculinity, which he ties directly to his sexuality and is often disgusted with any threats towards it. In this first example, he talks a little bit about that. I've invented in myself a kind of pleasure in playing the housewife for Giovanni, or housewife after Giovanni had gone to work. I threw out the paper, the bottles, the fantastic accumulation of trash, but I am not a housewife. Men can never be housewives. Not only does the story end badly for David, but also for Giovanni. There's a spoiler alert. Giovanni is accused and later executed for killing a man in self-defense against sexual assault, while David flees, abandoning him, distraught, guilty, conflicted, and miserable. The last scene of the book is of David imagining Giovanni's execution and grasping for his own quote-unquote reform. I look at my troubling sex and wonder how it can be redeemed, how I can save it from the knife. The journey to the grave has already begun. The journey to corruption is always already half over. This villainization, tragedy making, and punishment of queer characters, though, was no more true than for the titillating, money-making pulp novels of the mid-20th century, where even realistic characters were exaggerated or exploited. As you can see here, the cover copy often proclaimed the evil of queerness in order to meet the morality requirements, while the come hither illustrations beckoned the reader into their pages and promised lascivious details. So I think you can see some of these subtitles down here. Told with unblushing honesty, here is a penetrating study of society's greatest curse, homosexuality. The iconic character Bebo Brinker from Anne Banyan, it's still in the same one. We'll go back to that one. I think that's one of these, maybe Odd Girl Out. Describes herself this way. Maybe I grew up too fast. Maybe that's my trouble. I feel so lost out here, hung up between two worlds, half kid, half adult, half boy, half girl. And sometimes it seems like I get the dirty side of both. Patricia Highsmith's Price of Salt, which was fairly recently made into the movie Carol, broke free of some of the stereotypical exploitation, particularly the butch-femme relationship. And it gave one of the first semi-happy endings, but that came at a cost. The couple ended up together, but one of them loses everything, including access to her child. The trajectory of queer characterization in literature is very much the reflection of the lives lived by queer people and the realities, not the actual narratives themselves, but how queer literature was received, and how it was, and what was dictated in it. So others said what they could write, and laws and publishers demanded that how they depicted queer characters. This all changed with the Stonewall Uprising, and it marked the beginning of the civil rights movement for LGBTQ+ people. These were riots in New York, in Greenwich Village, that were waged against a police raid that took place June 28, 1969. They're frequently cited as the first instance in American history when the gay community fought back against a government-sponsored system that persecuted sexual minorities. And it has become the defining moment of the civil rights movement for LGBTQ people. This was almost a militant movement, especially at the beginning, and it demanded more positive queer representations and portrayals. In this period, in the 1970s, it ushered in what Michael Neva calls the golden age of queer literature in the 80s and 90s, primarily due to the overabundance of queer presses willing and able to publish queer literature without the constraints, without the censorship. Writers could now define for themselves what queer representation and portrayals would be. And they often judged older generations calling them, products of the dark age, and they were determined to change it. Here's where a burden of representation comes into play. There was a pressure to be perfectly queer. And for this time period, directly after Stonewall, perfectly queer meant pretty near perfect, harmonious, utopic. And it had led to the utopically queer archetype. In these stories, the writers avoided stereotypes, particularly if they were heteronormative, so the butch-femme relationship. They've depicted harmonious and happy relationship, self-fulfillment of the characters, healthy independence. If there was darkness and despair, it was now assigned to heterosexual characters. And interestingly, there was a rise in the popularity of sci-fi novels with queer characters. For example, I have Joanna Russ up here. Her short story, When It Changed, features a planet inhabited only by women. While away, the women have adapted their unique situation and enjoy living without men. They learned how to create children combining ova, and they participate in same-sex marriages. Here's a bit of characterization from the story. Katie drives like a maniac. She's good though, extremely good. And I've seen her take the whole car apart and put it together again in a day. The funny thing about my wife though, she will not handle guns. Katie and I have 3 children between us, one of hers and 2 of mine. Eureka, my eldest, was asleep in the back seat, dreaming 12-year-old dreams of love and war. Someday soon, like all of them, she will disappear for weeks on end to come back grimy and proud, having knifed her first cougar or shot her first bear. For someone who's fought 3 duels, I'm afraid far, far too much. I'm getting old. I told this to my wife. You're 34, she said, laconic to the point of silence, that one. Far out in the country, electric green trees rushed into our headlights and around the car. I reached down next to me where we bolt the carrier panel to the door and eased my rifle onto my lap. These women have agency. They're not murderous, but protected. They're nurturing and tough, defying the stereotypes. They are dressed for practicality, not glamour. The ending is vague, but it suggests that it might not be wholly happy as men arrive and question their way of life and their gender roles. But from a craft perspective, these characters are shown directly and indirectly through dialogue, appearance, action, thought, and interpretation. We get a much fuller picture, if not an entirely realistic one. Similar things could be said of the characters and characterizations in many others of this time period, including Maupin's serialized novel, Tales of the City, that chronicled gay and straight San Francisco. The characters in this novel or the series are positively drawn, and the narrative is light, but perhaps overly unrealistically so. And so much so that they come more 2D rather than 3D. Where publishers like Barbara Greer at Naiad were unapologetically supporting writers of romances, mysteries, westerns, works of science fiction, all featuring heroines and happy endings, even amidst criticism from writers like Bertha Harris, who called this writing the equivalent of Winkeburgers, too easy to consume and for consumption's sake only. Others seem to favor what was to become an urgent political responsibility. And this takes us to the politically queer archetype. Neva puts it like this: the growing gay and lesbian political and cultural assertiveness in the face of attacks by religious bigots and right-wing Republicans account for some of this growth, but the single most important factor was the AIDS crisis. And literature of the AIDS crisis, there became a lot of it, especially in the 80s and 90s. One of the most famous, of course, is the play by Tony Kushner, Angels in America. This play is complex, often metaphorical, and at times symbolic. And it's an examination of AIDS and homosexuality in the 1980s. There are major and minor characters, some of which are supernatural, and some in the play contains multiple roles for several actors. But it primarily focuses on a gay couple in Manhattan. And these characters are more fully drawn. Another politically queer archetype is the out and proud or coming out narrative archetype. And this includes one of my favorite examples, that takes direct characterization quite literally through the combination of graphics and text. And here we have an example of Alison Bechdel's Dykes to Watch Out for. These political and coming out examples are important in queer literary history and in the movement itself. In terms of characterization, they illustrate probably the most fully realized 3D characters up to this point. They were brought to life by all the tools available to them, directly and indirectly, in a way that wasn't one-sided, not wholly negative, not wholly positive. So they're more humanized, whole portrayals. They're protagonists more often than merely supporting roles or supporting villains. And their stories are driven by a desire within themselves to come out, to fight for equality, to fight a disease, not forced upon them or exploited from them, as we saw in some of the earlier fiction. However, the political motivations may have also made them more likely to rely still on stereotypes, even though they were shown in a more positive light. But this still limited the complexity of the characters, still giving us somewhat 1 to 2 dimensional characterization. One of the primary goals in creating well-crafted characters, particularly main characters, is to make them complex. And a character is complex if they have conflict and contradiction, with a range of possibility, capable of change. So we're going to look a little bit about how creating complex characterizations work. One of the best ways to reveal conflict is to produce conflict between methods of characterization. So internal versus external, direct versus indirect. You could set a character's thoughts against their actions, appearance, or dialogue, and tension is produced. Another way would be to present the reader with a judgment on the character, either through another character or through the author, and then let the character speak, act, or appear, or think in contradiction to this. In other words, you're creating characters that are not quote unquote perfect. Sometimes they aren't even likable, but they're most fully realized. They're more human. And so this takes us finally to the complex queer archetype. You may have noted the lack of examples from identities outside of gay and lesbian ones, and you're right to do so. In the past, many bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, and asexual or other portrayals were not recognized as such. They were sort of defaulted, lumped in with gay and lesbian. For example, Baldwin's character David was often labeled and is still often labeled as gay when bisexual or pansexual might be a more appropriate terminology, but it wasn't used as commonly at the time. And in Russ's story, when it changed, gender non-binary might apply to the women, but it wouldn't have been applied at that time. However, not surprisingly, in recent fiction that features characters that cover the span of these identities, and they are some of the stories that are giving us the most fully realized complex characters today. For example, in Carmen Maria Machado's My Body and Other Parties, her story Inventory stands out as a representation of complex pansexual characters. It's a story in 20 parts recalling sexual encounters between the unnamed first-person female narrator and a myriad of lovers as she nears the end of the world after a virus outbreak. I was going to share an example, but I thought maybe we might skip that so we can skip that anxiety. Instead, I'm going to give you an example from Rachel Gold's Being Emily, a well-written, realistic story about the emotional challenges of coming out as trans. I'll change my legal name when I can, I said. To Emily, she asked. Emily Christine Hess. She turned a little sideways in her seat so she could look at me more fully. I played a male character for a few months, she said, like a year ago when I was really into player versus player combat. I felt like people listened to me more in the game when I was a 7-foot tall guy. I thought you just played girl characters so you could look at their butts. I laughed. I love that there's at least one world where I can show up and be female, I told Claire. It feels like magic to me. Like the Wizard of Oz, she said. Yes, I agreed. However, some would say that the fully realized and complex, however fully realized and complex these characters are, this still isn't perfectly queer. Even stories with complex characters, the conflict is generated most often by their queer identities and the sometimes important and urgent need to politicize their identity. There's a lot of criticism, especially from younger readers today and audiences of younger generations that want stories that aren't about the tragedies of being queer, the trials of coming out, or about their identities. We're ready to move on from this. So what is going to be the next perfectly queer? Perhaps we might come up with our own Bechdel test. I don't know if everybody's heard of it, but the Bechdel test is a measure of representation of women in fiction. And it's named after Alison Bechdel, who we just saw an example from. It asks whether a work features at least two women who talk to each other about something other than a man. So is Perfectly Queer a work that features two queer characters, at least one of them complex, in a narrative about something other than a love or sex interest, or about being queer, just living and dealing with life like humans do? Are there any out there? Is there any literature with complex queer characters fully realized, not based on stereotypes or one-sided portrayals that pass our new Bechdel test? In my research, every example I found seemed to fall short in one way or another. The characters weren't complex enough, not quite fully realized or thin, or they were heroes or villains. My friend's 13-year-old spent a good deal of time the other day trying to convince me that She-Ra fit the criteria. And I was going to show you a clip, but I don't think we have audio on here, do we? Yeah. I encourage you to go view clips of She-Ra and see if you think that she fits the bill. And all of this, of course, has me looking at my own work, and I found examples of all of the, stuff that we've seen here, the good, the bad, and the ugly. None of them perfectly queer in this latest definition. And so, for instance, I have a short scene I can share with you from the novel I'm working on, entitled about a woman who loses custody of her son for being gay. And it's the beginning of the novel, and so I'm creating a character here, creating characterization, and starting with dialogue. "Well, you're not dying, ma'am," said the doctor, strolling into her room. "Don't call me ma'am. I'm barely 40 and surely younger than you," she laughed. There were small lines around her eyes, but otherwise she looked at least 10 years younger and robust, if anything, a little weather-worn, like someone who had just been on a long ski holiday. The doctor laughed too. "Yesterday you reminded me you had a son, thought he was my age." He patted her arm, smiling. "Oh, don't tease an old lady." The doctor marked some things on her chart, put it at the end of the bed. "Your liver is fine. That was a close call. You'll meet with your regular doctor this afternoon, so hopefully this doesn't happen again." A sense of dread spread across Death's face. He said it as if it were something that had just happened to her, an accident, a moment of forgetfulness perhaps, rather than something she'd done to herself deliberately. "Give me my reading glasses, would you, before you leave?" "Certainly, ma'am. I mean, miss," the doctor said, and handed over a slim pair of glasses. He shut the door on the way out. She slipped the glasses on her face and smoothed back her sandy blonde hair, still cut in a pixie cut. Her only slightly graying roots gave her away, but she pulled it off rather well. She had always been stylish, ahead of the trends, but this is the hair she'd sported since that summer, the summer that had made her almost famous and definitely admired in some circles, but abhorred, labeled as a bitch, just trash in others, unfit. The summer that ruined her life, that was years ago, and she was still running from it all, haggard and out of breath. Her hair, though, had never gone out of style. Most of my work centers around being queer, and I do think these stories are still important, but perhaps they're just part of the picture. How possible, necessary, realistic is it to create complex, fully realized and humanized, Bechdel-tested characters and narratives? It's a question I want to leave you with, and it's sort of a challenge. So I leave you with a sort of writing exercise. Write a scene with two queer characters, at least one of them complex, having a conversation, say, in a public place. Create them through dialogue, appearance, action, thought, interpretation of the other character, avoiding stereotypes and polarizations. In the scene, something must be at stake. At least one of them wants something. But what they want in their conversation must be about something other than love or sex, or about being queer. It's a tall order, but I think we can do it. As Toni Morrison said, if there's a book that you want to read, but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. To me, Perfectly Queer isn't perfect. It's about being human, deeply flawed, conflicted, complex, sometimes unlikable, but with sink your teeth in stories that matter, that are interesting, whatever they are about. But they're mostly about being humans. And I hope we'll continue to write and see these stories out there. Thank you guys all for listening. I'm happy to take any questions you have and continue the discussion. Anybody have any questions?
Do we need to raise our hands to ask questions, or I can't find a way to do that? This is Karl Lagatsky, a former MFA at the W.
Hi, Carl.
How are you? I don't know if this is the right first question to ask, but it's something that I've often wondered, and you know that I have. Would you be willing to offer advice to those writers who might be straight and cis, who want to reflect the real world and include queer characters in their stories that are real people?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you know, you bring up a good point. It's not only queer writers that can write, you know, queer stories. As a writer, you want to, like you said, be able to show the real world and the fullness of that world. And you may have queer characters, you have straight characters. Just like you wouldn't expect an actor to only play somebody that was just like them, you know. So I think sticking to all the lessons of craft, the way you would with any character, is the best place to start. You want to create fully realized characters on the page. You want to, you know, use all of those tools at your disposal, put them in action, make them active. There's a lot of debate right now about tokenization and queer baiting in literature. So tossing in a queer character just to check a box, for instance, tokenization, or claiming you've got queer characters in your story or show or whatever, but either they don't really appear or they don't have a real role, or they're just, you know, sort of background. That would be queer baiting. So I think there's a push to really give these characters more center stage and full development. So that would be my advice, to treat them as you would any other character and give them a full story and a full, make them more fully human. Good question.
I was wondering, you mentioned a little bit about younger generation readers, and definitely getting the sense that, you know, K through 12 world right now is a really different world than, you know, decades ago. And also the increase of graphic novels, and thinking perhaps there's some overlap there, and then you study this development of graphic novel area.
There are graphic novels in general are on the rise, and there seems to be a lot more queer representation in these novels. Well, I don't know about a lot more. I haven't done actual numbers, but there seems to be a lot of queer representation. I have students bring me graphic novels all the time. Check this out, you know. So I think it you know, it's a popular genre, especially for younger generations. I'm not really sure why, but except that possibly it's a relatively new form. Alison Bechdel, who we saw here with her Dykes Would Watch Out For, was a comic strip that she did, but she then later wrote Fun Home, which you might be familiar with, which has been turned into a Broadway play, and it had an immense popularity. So, good question. Did that answer your question? Kind of. Yes.
Since I've been out of the drama that leads directly to something I was wondering. Talk about Chris, you talk about that. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of queer characters over the last 20-something years.
Yeah.
I was in graduate school for theater during the time.
Yes.
So we got that a lot. Do you think it's easier for theater for directors like literally three-dimensional? For people to accept them?
Is that the question, G? Do I think it's easier in theater? I think that, yeah, absolutely. I think that it does play a big part of it. In film and theater, there is that element. In writing, you have to create all five senses to make a character come alive. But when you're watching a film or a play, you've got a couple of them already taken care of by the thing itself. So to some extent, I think, yes, we're seeing real people, and that is kind of bridging that gap of humanization. So I think that's a good, excellent point. Okay. Any other questions?
There's a question from Zoom. Feel free to jump in. I think we can hear you. I'm watching Facebook, but I haven't seen the question yet.
Yay. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I will say, please come join us for treats over here. I'm sorry on Zoom, you don't get to have the treats with us, but you're with us in spirit. Thank you again all for coming and listening. And I'm glad to continue this conversation afterwards. If you have any questions, follow-up questions as it comes up, feel free to contact me. I love to talk about this stuff. So thank you again.
Thank you all for coming, and there are a few reception items over there on the table. If you feel more comfortable taking them with you, you're more than welcome to do that, or walk if the sun comes back out, maybe stepping outside to eat. Whatever you feel most comfortable with, that's fine with us. Thank you all for being here, and I hope you will take some with you or share some with us. Thanks to you, Zoom folks. I'm gonna close out the meeting.